last week we left the 12th chapter of Shabbat, which deals, among other things, with writing. And this week we're going to move into the 13th chapter, which deals with clothes, or with making clothes on Shabbat. Now, we've seen this Mishnah before, actually, in the 7th chapter. And maybe it's useful just to flick back to the 7th chapter to remind ourselves. We had a description of the 39 Av Malachot, the 39 archetypal activities that make us liable for work on Shabbat. And in the 7th chapter, it enumerates them. Right in the middle of all the material on, in the middle of all the material on carrying, actually, the Mishnah goes off on a segue with some generalizations. And one of the generalizations it brings is the, if you like, the statement of the 39 Malachot. Hang on a second while I just flick through this source sheet to find it. It's the second Mishnah in the 7th chapter. Here we are. The primary labors are 40 less 1. Avot malacha 40 chaser echad, 39, or 40 less 1. And they're grouped in this Mishnah into 3 groups. The first group are to do with baking. So we're going to start with sowing and then go through plowing and reaping and binding and threshing and grinding right the way through to baking. The second group is to do with making clothes. And the Mishnah is very precise here. I mean, we're going to start with shearing wool. So we're going to start right at the beginning with shearing wool and then combing it and bleaching it and dyeing it. And then we're going to weave it. So the Mishnah says, someone who makes 2 loops. Someone who weaves 2 threads. Someone who divides 2 threads. The minimum critical quantity is going to be 2 threads. That's the Mishnah in the 7th chapter. And then after dealing with the group of activities to do with making clothes, we deal with another group of activities to do with writing. And in fact, hunting is hunting a deer and slaughtering. It is preparatory to making the hide and being used to write. And so we'll see that in the 7th chapter, the act of catching a deer is something to do with writing rather than to do with making clothes. And we'll see in the 13th chapter that the taxonomy is slightly different. But let's hold on to the idea that in the 7th chapter, 2 threads are the critical quantity. And now let's jump back to our Mishnah in chapter 13. And Rabbi Eliezer says, Ha'oreg shlosha chutin, someone who weaves 3 threads, batchila at the beginning, va'achat al ha'arig, someone who weaves 3 threads at the beginning of a garment, or 1 on cloth which is already woven, is liable. So Rabbi Eliezer has he's got a different version of the halacha, a different version of the Mishnah. V'chachamim omrim, and the sages say, bein batchila, bein basof, shiro shnei chutin. Whether it's at the beginning or whether it's at the end, the measure is 2 threads. So we're seeing here 2 opinions, of which the final one, the view of the Chachamim, made it through into the Mishnah in chapter 7. The critical quantity is 2. The critical quantity is 2. Whatever we're going to do 2 of. So what are we going to do 2 of? Well, the Mishnah continues. Someone who makes 2 batei nirin, and it's always translated as loops. But what are these nirin? And Kahati says that the niran is a Greek word which refers to a thread, but also refers to a beam around the loom. And here's a picture which I found for you in, actually, this is in the Steinsaltz Shas. So if on the corners of the Steinsaltz Shas, there are some lovely pictures of kind of life in the time of the Mishnah. And he has a picture of a beam on the end of a loom, we need to imagine a loom as a construction with essentially at least two beams on each side, on each end of the cloth. And we've got the warp and the weft. The warp are the fixed threads that are the warp are fixed threads that are going to be tied to these beams, and the weft are the cross threads that go in and out. And in a sophisticated loom, actually, we would double these up. Maybe next time we can bring some pictures of looms in the time of the Mishnah. But this Mishnah seems to be referring to putting two loops of thread on these beams. So in other words, we're creating two threads of warp on the loom. That's the minimal quantity which the Mishnah is talking about. Someone who's making two loops on the warp. Bakiros, either on the it could be on the cross pieces, or the keros. The keros, there are lots of different translations of keros, but it seems to be something that you slip in between between the threads of the warp in order to tighten up the weft. It's a big piece of wood that we're going to slide in after we've threaded the weft through in order to push everything down, to tighten it all up on the warp. Banafa. So we might make two loops on a sifter, actually. So now we're not weaving at all in a loom. We're repairing a sifter. Or a kavra, or a sieve. Or a sal, or a basket. So these are all different situations where we might be making loops. There's a loom, a sifter, a sieve, or a basket. But the measure is the same. Chayav, two loops obliges us to bring a sin offering. And the general case is ve'hatofer shtei teferot, and someone who sews two stitches. Ve'hakoreh almonat lipor shtei teferot is also going to be chayav. And someone who sews two stitches and someone who tears in order to sew two stitches. The Mishnah then I brought you, by the way, I brought you the definition of Jastrow of the keros. He calls it a row of slips or thrums in the loom, but I'm not sure. It's the keros is a difficult word to translate, and I brought you Jastrow. I'm not sure it helps very much. The Mishnah continues, hakoreh b'chamato, someone who tears in anger. So now this is not someone who's tearing in order to create something, but who's tearing in anger, who's in a burst of anger. Someone who tears in his anger or for his dead. Anyone who damages are exempt. Damage is not considered creative activity on Shabbat. But if you damage in order to repair, the measure is as for repairing. And that's a general principle. So when we learned, for example, the halakha of erasing, we learned that the act of creativity on Shabbat is to erase in order to write two letters. It's not to erase for the sake of erasing. And interestingly, the Rambam comes back with a different view. The Rambam has a view that there is some creative act in destruction. That he says, look, the halakha is that someone who tears in anger or because of a dead person whom he's obliged to tear for. So sometimes we're obliged to, if we're in the presence of someone who's dying, we're obliged to tear for them. So the Rambam says, chayav, we are obligated. Ve'atam shehakorea because someone who's tearing in these situations, his mind is settled. And I've translated this as his emotion is moderated. Ve'chomamo mitpasher. His emotion is poshro, is to be made lukewarm. His emotion is moderated by the tearing. And the Rambam says, Vehu domeh li metaken, and this is similar to repair. And it's interesting that the Rambam is a physician, but he does seem to have a psychological view on, he's got a psychological view on the potential for repair of these acts. And he seems to connect the tearing that we do to fulfill a mitzvah when we're at a particularly emotional moment, and the tearing that we might do in anger. He seems to recognize that a physical act can create emotional healing, and that's a significant comment on this Mishnah.